Prince Andrew lost his royal title after being arrested for his secret deal to sell classified documents to the Chinese. The fall before the fall did not happen overnight. It was not marked by one catastrophic event but by years of quiet erosion, an unraveling that began the moment the world stopped believing in the innocence of Prince Andrew. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. Long before the flashing lights of police vehicles cut through the morning fog, long before his name became synonymous with disgrace and betrayal, there was a man who still believed he could rewrite his story. But redemption is rarely kind to those who refuse to face the truth about themselves. In the months leading up to his arrest, Andrew lived in an uneasy rhythm of denial and desperation. Royal Lodge, once a symbol of grace and authority, had turned into a gilded cage. Its high ceilings and manicured lawns only emphasized his solitude. The laughter of guests no longer filled its halls. The invitations had stopped coming, and even the family gatherings had grown tense and infrequent. He had been reduced to a figure of controversy, tolerated but never truly welcomed. He spent his mornings pacing near the window, watching the empty drive as though expecting visitors who would never come. Newspapers piled up on his desk, their headlines dissecting every movement of his estranged family, while his own name, when mentioned, was a reminder of the past he could never escape. The silence became unbearable, so he filled it with calls, endless calls to old acquaintances, forgotten business partners, and anyone willing to pick up. Some indulged him out of pity, others out of curiosity, but most had long moved on. Yet in that silence, something else began to take root. Resentment. Against the press that had humiliated him. Against his brother, now king, who had quietly ensured his exile from royal duties. And most of all, against the system that once revered him but now treated him like a ghost. For years, he had convinced himself that the world's judgment was unfair. He was not the villain they made him out to be, he told himself. He was a man caught in the crossfire of perception and politics, a scapegoat for a family desperate to maintain its public image. He clung to that narrative because it was easier than admitting the truth, that his arrogance, his misjudgments, and his blindness to consequence had brought him here. But inside that pride lay a dangerous vulnerability. When a man loses everything but refuses to accept it, he becomes easy prey. The walls that once protected Andrew were now riddled with cracks, and through those cracks, shadows began to slip in. In early 2025, a new circle of acquaintances emerged around him. They were polite, well-dressed, and came bearing opportunities wrapped in flattery. They spoke of investments, international partnerships, and discreet financial arrangements. At first, it seemed harmless, a chance to rebuild his image through charitable ventures and private consultancy. After all, what harm could there be in advising businessmen on international relations? But the tone shifted quickly. The men he met were not ordinary investors. They were smooth, disciplined, and evasive about their affiliations. One of them, a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Lee, possessed a kind of calm authority that unsettled even Andrew. They met first at a private club in Mayfair, then again at a secluded estate outside London. The discussions were never overtly suspicious. Yet beneath the polite smiles and measured words, there was a game being played that Andrew did not fully understand. Lee spoke of the world changing, of alliances shifting, of how influence was the new currency of power. He told Andrew that he still mattered, that his insight, his connections, his knowledge of the inner workings of the royal and military institutions could be valuable again. Those words struck deep. Valuable. For a man who had been branded as worthless, it was a lifeline. He began attending dinners where introductions were made to people with deep pockets and foreign accents. They spoke of mutual benefit and information exchange, under the guise of global cooperation. Small requests followed, harmless tidbits at first, nothing that could be considered classified. But every favor brought with it a reward, a donation to one of his charities, a discreet transfer into an account he never spoke about. It was gradual, deliberate, almost invisible in its design. And like most traps, it felt comfortable until it snapped shut. By the time he realized what he was part of, the pattern had already formed. Emails, encrypted under aliases. Meetings disguised as social visits. Documents passed under vague pretenses. It all seemed like part of a larger plan he could not quite name. But he told himself he was not betraying anyone. He wasn't giving away secrets. He was simply sharing insights, perspectives. Words that could not harm a country built on centuries of strength. But those watching him from afar knew differently. British intelligence had long suspected attempts by foreign agents to penetrate networks of influence through individuals close to the monarchy. Andrew, isolated and resentful, was an obvious target. When the first whispers of his new associations reached the right ears, surveillance began quietly. At first, they found little more than meetings, correspondence, and unusual transactions. But as months passed, a disturbing picture began to form, a pattern of communication with entities directly tied to foreign intelligence operations. Meanwhile, inside Royal Lodge, Andrew grew restless. He felt watched but couldn't explain why. His paranoia deepened, though he mistook it for guilt. He began avoiding his few remaining friends, snapping at staff, locking himself away for hours at a time. He wrote letters to his brother, letters that never reached their destination, pleading for a chance to redeem himself in public life. But the palace had moved on. Charles had made it clear that the monarchy's reputation came before family sentiment. Andrew's requests were met with silence. The family's patience had been tested for too long. To Charles, his brother had already become a liability, a relic of the monarchy's most turbulent years. Inside that rejection, Andrew found a twisted sense of justification. If the institution no longer wanted him, why should he owe it loyalty? It was a dangerous thought, one that he never said aloud but that grew louder with each passing day. The night before everything began to collapse, a storm raged over Windsor. Rain pounded against the windows of Royal Lodge as Andrew sat alone in his study. On his desk lay a briefcase, ordinary in appearance, unremarkable to anyone else. Inside were documents he had collected over years of service, notes from meetings, and correspondence that, in the wrong hands, could be interpreted as sensitive. He had told himself he was keeping them as reference material, personal archives of his contribution to the crown. But that night, as he poured himself another glass of whiskey, the briefcase took on a different meaning. The call came shortly after midnight. Lee's voice on the other end was calm and precise. There was urgency in his tone, masked under courtesy. A request, one final transaction, a private meeting to finalize their cooperation. Andrew hesitated. He asked questions this time, more than usual, but the reassurance came swift. It was nothing serious, just a formality. And for reasons he would never fully understand, he agreed. The next day, he drove out under the pale winter sky, unaware that he was being followed. His car moved through narrow country roads, trailed at a distance by unmarked vehicles. Every word he spoke, every movement he made, was being recorded. The meeting itself lasted less than an hour. When he returned home, he thought it was over. But by then, it had only just begun. The intelligence team had seen enough. Within hours, warrants were drafted, and a plan was put in motion. The order came down quietly, swift, efficient, final. By dawn, Royal Lodge would be surrounded, and the man who once carried the title of His Royal Highness would be facing the unthinkable. But in those final hours before his arrest, Andrew slept soundly for the first time in weeks, unaware that history was about to close its hands around him. He dreamed, perhaps, of the days when he was still celebrated, when his name meant dignity and honor. He could never have imagined that those memories would soon become his only refuge. The fall before the fall had reached its end. The descent was complete, and as the first light of morning touched the horizon, the quiet hum of approaching engines signaled the beginning of a reckoning he could no longer escape. Desperation is a quiet poison. It seeps in slowly, disguised as determination, until a man can no longer tell the difference between survival and self-destruction. By the time Prince Andrew realized how far he had fallen, the desperation had already taken control. It was not just the loss of privilege or the weight of public disgrace that consumed him, it was the realization that he had no power left. Every door that once opened at his name was now firmly shut. The charities he once championed had cut ties. His military affiliations had been revoked. Even within his own family, he had become a burden no one wanted to acknowledge. For a man raised in the constant glow of royal relevance, being forgotten was its own kind of death. That was the wound he could never heal from. Each morning at Royal Lodge began the same way. The butler, one of the few long-serving staff members who hadn't resigned, would bring in tea and a stack of letters. Most were bills, formal notices, or correspondence from lawyers managing what little remained of his finances. Occasionally, there would be a letter from an old friend, a polite check-in, nothing more. But what he longed for never came: a letter from his brother, or even a word of acknowledgement from the palace. King Charles had turned silence into a weapon. And in that silence, Andrew's resentment grew into something dangerous. He tried to keep busy with the pretense of purpose. He organized old photo albums, revisited his naval achievements, and read military journals as if to remind himself of who he once was. But the illusion never lasted long. The echo of laughter in empty rooms reminded him of the dinners he no longer attended, the ceremonies from which he was permanently absent. When the calls from his foreign acquaintances began again, offering partnerships, consulting fees, and invitations to discreet gatherings abroad, he told himself it was business. Legitimate business. After all, hadn't he earned the right to use his experience in a way that benefited him? Money had become an unspoken problem. His security detail was expensive, the upkeep of Royal Lodge draining, and the family trust no longer as generous as it once was. Quietly, he began exploring financial ventures outside traditional royal oversight: property investments, private sponsorships, and consulting roles with firms he barely understood. His aides warned him to be cautious, but he waved them off. "I know what I'm doing," he would say with the clipped confidence of a man who couldn't bear another lecture. But the men who sought him out knew exactly what he was doing. They had studied him, his weaknesses, his pride, his need to feel important. They didn't need to pressure him, they simply needed to offer him what he craved most: relevance. One evening, in early spring, a sleek black car arrived at the lodge under the pretense of a private meeting. Inside was the same man who had once approached him, Lee, always polite, always controlled. This time, he wasn't alone. Another associate accompanied him, introduced as an international financier named Mr. Zhao. Their conversation began harmlessly, the usual pleasantries about global trade, diplomacy, and economic opportunity. But as the night wore on, the tone shifted. Zhao spoke with precision, his words wrapped in charm but laced with intent. He told Andrew that there were individuals in Asia who admired the British monarchy, who believed its perspective still carried global influence. "They would be honored to consult with you," Zhao said, "especially on matters of strategic cooperation." Andrew hesitated, asking what kind of cooperation they meant. Lee smiled gently, as though it were all too obvious. "Trade, international development, cultural exchange," he said, each phrase calculated to sound harmless. "Of course, we would ensure discretion. You understand how delicate these things can be." And there it was, that word again. Discretion. A word that had followed Andrew all his life, used to cover mistakes, affairs, and secrets best left unspoken. He had lived under its shadow so long that it no longer frightened him. The next day, a wire transfer arrived. A modest sum, labeled as a consultation retainer. It was enough to pay off a few outstanding bills. He told himself it was harmless. He told himself it was fair compensation for his time. Over the following months, the relationship deepened. The conversations became more frequent, more specific. Zhao and Li requested his opinions on international defense collaborations, hypothetical questions at first, but increasingly detailed over time. Andrew, eager to impress, offered what he knew, sometimes from memory, sometimes from old briefings he'd once attended. He didn't consider it treason. In his mind, these were harmless exchanges between men of influence. He believed his insights were outdated, inconsequential. But every word he spoke, every document he referenced, was being recorded, analyzed, and transmitted to people he would never meet. At first, he noticed nothing unusual. But slowly, the coincidences began. A journalist contacted him with unnerving accuracy about his private meetings. A government contact stopped returning his calls. A familiar black car parked near the lodge more often than before. The paranoia that followed was suffocating. He began double-checking his locks, avoiding phone calls, and restricting his movements. He even dismissed 2 staff members without explanation, convinced they were leaking information. Then came the dinner that changed everything. It was held at an exclusive private residence in Kensington, attended by a small but powerful group of businessmen, diplomats, and political intermediaries. Andrew arrived wearing the practiced charm he once carried easily, though beneath the surface, his nerves were raw. Li and Zhao were there, as usual, but this time the conversation was sharper, more pointed. One of the guests, an older man with an accent Andrew couldn't quite place, leaned forward and asked directly, do you still have access to the old naval communications protocols? The question froze him. It was too specific, too dangerous. He brushed it off with a half smile, insisting he no longer had such access. But the man pressed. You might remember the structure. Even the framework would be useful. Something in Andrew's expression betrayed him. The others saw it. They didn't need to ask again. After the dinner, he drove home in silence. The rain blurred the road ahead, and for the first time, doubt began to gnaw at him. He knew what they were after now. And worse, he knew what he had already given them, small fragments of information that, when pieced together, could reveal much more than he intended. That night, he sat at his desk, staring at the transfer receipts and encrypted emails on his laptop. The evidence of his complicity was right there in front of him, but he couldn't bring himself to delete it. To erase it would be to admit guilt. Instead, he closed the screen, poured another drink, and told himself there was still time to set things right. But it was already too late. Unknown to him, MI5 had obtained authorization weeks earlier to monitor all his communications. The investigation had begun as a precaution, a quiet measure taken after reports from palace staff about suspicious visitors and unusual financial activity. What they found shocked even the most experienced agents. Transcripts, recordings, coded messages, proof that someone within Britain's most protected circles was providing information to foreign intelligence. Andrew's name appeared again and again. The news reached the palace through official channels, though its delivery was deliberately subdued. Charles received the report privately, read it twice, and said nothing for several minutes. The silence in the room was unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy and controlled. Handle it discreetly, he said. No leaks. No public scandal until we know everything. But the leaks were inevitable. A whisper in the intelligence community, a rumor among journalists, a quiet conversation overheard at Westminster, it was enough to set everything in motion. Before long, the tabloids were circling again. Headlines speculated about a senior royal under investigation for espionage. The palace issued denials, but the words carried no conviction. Inside, everyone knew the truth would come out. It always did. Meanwhile, Andrew clung to the illusion that he could still contain it. He stopped answering calls from his associates. He avoided public appearances. But in doing so, he only confirmed the suspicions surrounding him. When the first summons came, a polite but firm request for an interview with intelligence officials, he refused. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, a smear campaign orchestrated by those who wanted to destroy him. But his protestations fell on deaf ears. The evidence had grown too strong. The second summons was not a request. And when the agents arrived at Royal Lodge, he was sitting at his desk, staring at the same briefcase that had become the symbol of his undoing. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply looked at the men in black suits, nodded once, and said quietly, "Let's get this over with." As he was led out through the side entrance, the cameras flashed like lightning across the estate. The world, once again, was watching him, but this time, there was no sympathy left. The desperate prince who once sought redemption had crossed a line from which there was no return. And though he could not see it yet, the storm that followed would not only destroy what remained of his life, it would shake the very foundations of the monarchy itself. It began, as so many royal scandals do, in whispers. Quiet conversations behind closed doors, fleeting glances between aides who suddenly stopped speaking when someone else entered the room. For months, something seemed off about Prince Andrew's activities, his sudden flurry of private meetings, uncharacteristic trips abroad, and discreet phone calls at odd hours of the night. Those closest to him dismissed it at first. They assumed the Duke of York was simply trying to rebuild his reputation after years of public scrutiny. But beneath the surface, something far more dangerous was taking shape. In early 2025, intelligence officials from MI5 and MI6 began noticing unusual data leaks. Classified government briefings were finding their way into foreign hands, sensitive discussions about defense technology, trade negotiations, and even strategic alliances with allied nations. The breaches were subtle at first, almost invisible. But as the leaks grew more precise, the investigators realized that someone high up was feeding this information to an outside power. And all signs pointed to one unsettling possibility: someone within the royal circle. It was almost unthinkable. The royal family, though not directly involved in government affairs, still had access to confidential briefings. The monarch and certain members of the family were regularly updated on matters of state. The idea that such privilege could be abused to sell secrets was more than a scandal, it was a betrayal of the crown itself. Still, investigators knew they couldn't act on mere suspicion.